Years ago, when I visited London, there was a relatively obscure, heavy stone vault blended right into the cemetery between a road and a large building. That was the tomb of the famous British preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And when I originally visited the tomb, if I didn't have someone to lead me there, I wouldn't have found it. Spurgeon's and his wife's names were engraved on the stone, but there was no information on the tomb itself about who he was. So the average sightseer could have easily missed it. It certainly wasn't a very spectacular memorial to the man who had such a tremendous impact on the Christian church. In fact, there are a lot of larger, more impressive tombs and grave sites all around. So his tended to somewhat blend in with all of the others. On seeing it, most wouldn't have realized it was the burial place of a man who in his time was more well-known and more influential in many ways than England's Prime Minister. And you know, that's kind of symbolic of how we've also treated biblical truth in general, and how we've treated the men who stood for biblical truth throughout history. In fact, at the time, as I stood there next to his grave, I couldn't help thinking about how much the church needs men like Charles Spurgeon today. Spurgeon was the kind of man who wasn't afraid to stand boldly for the truth, even when it meant he stood alone. Preaching the Word of God was his sole passion. He believed the church's tolerance of real preaching was already beginning to decline in his day because he looked around and saw that some ministers were experimenting with alternative approaches and shorter messages in order to be more relatable and to draw bigger crowds. He saw that preachers were beginning to compromise truth and doctrine by preaching less and doing other things more and more. But Spurgeon, being the ever-vigilant visionary, saw the great danger in that, and his concern thrust him into a battle for the truth that led eventually to his being censured by the very Baptist organization of whom he was originally the most prominent and respected leader. And it ultimately took such a toll on him that it led to his death. In other words, Charles Spurgeon thought that this issue of whether he should stick to the straightforward, God-ordained method of preaching in order to save souls, or move on to more relevant and interesting and entertaining methods, was so important that the battle for it actually negatively impacted his health and eventually cost him his life. One would hope that his fight and his death weren't in vain. But at times it's tempting to question that. Because if you compare the brave and godly attitude Spurgeon had toward the keeping of integrity and truth in preaching with the prevailing opinion of our day, here's what you'll find. Spurgeon's concerns were diametrically opposed to the perspective that is most common today. Let me give you a quick example. A few years ago, in a popular Christian magazine, a well-known preacher was venting his own loathing for long sermons. January 1st was coming, so he resolved to do better in the coming year. And this is what he wrote. He vowed that to him, that would mean, quote, wasting less time listening to long sermons and spending more time preparing short ones. People, I've discovered, will forgive even poor theology as long as they get out before noon, end quote. Do you understand the heart of that statement? The mindset is, it's better for the preacher to keep the congregation comfortable, entertained, and interested, even if what he's teaching isn't completely biblical. And unfortunately, that perfectly sums up the most common attitude in the church and Christian ministry today. Bad doctrine is tolerable, but a long sermon most certainly is not. How long the teaching or sermon is of far more concern to the average churchgoer than the actual content of the sermon. Going to Sunday brunch to feed our mouths now takes precedence over going to Sunday school for the nourishment of our souls. And in today's church, long-windedness has become a greater sin than heresy. I find that perplexing. Because what that means is we're willing to put personal comfort over vital virtues like truth and doctrine, and God's glory, And in the end, that kind of thinking has the capacity to destroy the church.